Good morning. Ayin Beis, Volume 3. We're on page 1286. Aleph Reish Pei Vav. Close to the bottom of the page. So the contrast, just to sum up, on page 1285, the Rebbe Rashab said, Inyan Mitzvos, Shem B'chinas Ha'isi is the Havaya Sheba Atzmus. The mitzvahs are the letters of Havaya and Atzmus, and primarily the letters Yud Kei, Rotzana Atzmi. The core desire of God is his mitzvahs, which is higher than the desire to create the worlds. Nevertheless, mitzvahs Marosh Rabbi is pastus Alesa Rots. Mitzvah b'chinas etzemer kameshula Atzmei. Umakol mokim b'chinas hagilui the Eid Ein Sof. And nevertheless, is the level of revelation in Eid Ein Sof. Of expression, I should say, of expression, of awareness, of revelation. The mitzvahs. And that goes on, the paragraph continues about Torah and mitzvahs, all being connected still, ultimately, of atzmus ha'oyer, but oyer of gilui. And now, in the paragraph on page 1286, he said, Kol zeh ma'ashakeli mamshech oyer. Everything we learned about Torah and mitzvahs is how the keli draws down it. But to transform the keli nepach la'ed, that the keli itself to be transformed into a divine expression, not just a channel, a keli, a container for it. That's through the neshamas, that they're also kelim, but they originate in who? Higher than shmoi. In a helam ha'atzmi, something that's beyond revelation altogether. That's not shayich, klal u'klal, he says. Not even begeder mokir and get the shaykhis ala elements. Not even a mokir dim mokir, not even a source to the source. And that's when the shamas are rooted. And so therefore it relates to a deeper level, and it draws from that level on chodesh. Because as we said, all the other levels, lower levels, you can't call them a completely new, unprecedented energy, because they were all there already in the original source, except it was concealed. It was biskalus of behelim, as we learned earlier. It's encompassed, but it's concealed. Here, it's a new energy because it was completely defied revelation altogether. So when it is nimshach, it's a ir chadash, and it also elevates, as the way he puts it, it adds ir into Shem Havaya more than it has on its own. And he said that's asid mitzik tzadikim sheyikru b'shmoi. That is not only they call by the name of Havaya, but they actually draw down into Havaya. V'shmartem, like he said, v'shomru derech Havaya. The second interpretation that they draws down more energy into the Yud Kei Vav Kei, which is the lower level, which is Shmoi. Basically drawing from who into Shmoi. Okay. And the second aspect of this is that it also is drawn all the way down below without discrimination. Because the level of Gilui, even the level of Gilui already relates to the structure of existence, so therefore there is gradations. Whereas this level completely is beyond any form of Gilui, and therefore, which is Gilui, there you can talk about an order, a progression, a process. And it cannot go everywhere equally. It's like the Kav. The Kav is subject to gradations, to more revelation, less revelation, like a teacher teaching to his students. Every student receives what they need. But this level that's completely beyond, when it's nimshach, like we learned earlier, that the higher the further it reaches, and kolshkein, for sure, this is the way it is with Helema. So now we can conclude and tie together the initial question, why the Hamshach of Mitzvahs needs the Hagdama, the preparation of Aved of Neshamis in Ava Rabbah. B'shum zeh shayidei zeh dafke nimshach teis ser b'shem Havaya. Because the mitzvahs can accomplish a certain amount, they bring great levels of revelation. But it's dafke the Neshamis with their Ava Rabbah that reaches into the Hu, into the Helam, the Etzem, and that brings a teis ser, abundance and addition, energy, in a ir chodesh, and that the gilui should be lamata mata. So mitzvahs without the neshamas and avarabba would not achieve quite that level. And that's where we stopped, 5 lines from the bottom of the page. And now he continues, a parenthesis, the qualification. Okay, because remember, we still have to understand well this whole relationship between the shamas and mitzvahs. We now understand that there are 2 different levels, and each one contributes something, like I discussed yesterday at length, based on the Tanya, the neshama, in contrast to Torah and mitzvahs, and they complement each other. But let's see how it continues to develop the idea. So now says the Rebbe Rashab like this. 5 lines from the bottom of 1286. The pages can be found at Chassidus at ayinbeis.com, also chassidusapply.com. It's all connects. Okay, linked together. Ube'emes, and in truth, hamshachas the mitzvahs, k'meshe hen b'sharshim b'chinas rotzen ha'elyon, the hamshachas of mitzvahs, the way they're on their root, in the rotzen ha'elyon. Remember, the mitzvahs is the rotzen atzmi of the Eibush. The mitzvahs are not an intermediary. They're not like building the world is mila dehedyeta, asara mamoris. This is so-called regular language. God is creating a world. Mitzvahs is ratzon atzmi. It reflects the very essence of the divine will. A mitzvah is not arbitrary in any way, God forbid. And it's the ultimate purpose, like we say, B'reishis Rishul Yisrael B'shul HaTorah. And as I mentioned again, both of them kodmu la'elam, Torah and Torah, mitzvahs and Yisrael. It's just that Yisrael is higher. But this does not diminish the power of a mitzvah being rooted in Ratzon Elyon. However, it's in the Gilui. It's in the level of Gilui la'atzmai, whereas the neshamas are rooted higher than any form of Gilui. So he says, now truth, the hamshachas of mitzvahs, the way they are in their root in the supernal will of God, who gam kinayde b'chol ma'idecha dafka. It's also through b'chol ma'idecha. Explicitly, dafka. Ki yadua be'inyan eisen etzein shamokim. As it's known in the idea of eisen etzein shamokim, that we have the concept is the eisen etzein shamokim means when you're following Ratzon HaMokim, the desire of God, there's Eisen Etzein Shemakim, there's Lei Eisen Etzein Shemakim. So there's 2 scenarios. So Chassidus explains Eisen Etzein Shemakim. I believe we learned it earlier as well in the interpretation that mitzvahs to be complete need the b'chol ma'idecha, which means you're doing it to fulfill the desire of God. And Eisen Etzein Shemakim refers to this hamshacha b'chol ma'idecha. I have to look up the exact details, but I recall that we actually learned it earlier. Ubila dei zeis, and without this b'chol ma'idecha, without this intensity, till now we were learning that you have mitzvahs. Mitzvahs draw down a certain high level of divine revelation, great, but to be able to reach the Helam and to reach this level that's higher than completely, all higher than everything, and comes down lamata mata, and a chodesh, for that you need b'chol meidecha. Now he's saying that in truth, the hamshachas of mitzvahs, the way they're in their root, require b'chol meidecha, and without it, hamshach yirak b'giluyim to say the ishtalshlus. And without it, the giluyim, the revelations of mitzvahs, will only be within the cosmic order. U'kamishn is bar le'il. Ach, that's what he adds in the parentheses, which needs explanation. What is he saying here exactly? That sounds very similar to what we just learned. And yet, let me finish the parentheses and then let's analyze it. Ach, however, beprotius, when you break it down further, ube'emik yeser, and on deeper level, hu kanal. It's like we discussed earlier. Now, what is he saying here? Didn't we just learn that there's 2 ways to do mitzvahs? One is you do mitzvahs regularly without the neshamis and the avarabba b'chol meidecha, and there the mitzvahs are mamshich eiris b'kelim. The keli is drawing the energy, and it's a high level. It's going all the way up to the levels of gili atzmi, like we learned in the previous page. etzem rotzen shehula atzmei, but it's still gilui, but it's a very high level. And then there's b'chol meidecha of the neshamas, that's hagdama to the mitzvahs, that causes a new energy coming from the helem of who and all the way below. So what is he saying in the parentheses? So most likely, and this is what seems to be what he's saying, there he says hagdama to Torah mitzvahs. He said that's why you need hagdama to mitzvahs. In the parentheses, he's saying that mitzvahs themselves also fundamentally are really achieving their goal when it's b'chol meidecha. In other words, you have two things. You can prepare yourself to first have a tremendous passion and an all-consuming love to God, as we learned at length. A level of b'chol meidecha that precedes mitzvahs. It's agdama to mitzvahs. And then the mitzvahs, of course, are infused with this higher level. In this parenthesis, saying that in truth, mitzvahs themselves also have to be done with this level of passion, with this level of b'chol meidecha. Ach bepratis ube'emek yeser, it's canal. So there's a subtle distinction here, but maybe not so subtle. He says, but when you break it down, and in deeper level, you really talk about the b'chol meidecha that precedes mitzvahs, in contrast to the b'chol meidecha within mitzvahs. So both are true. But bepratis ube'emek yeser, which itself needs explanation. What does that mean? I would again speculate. I'm speculating because it's not 100% clear to me that what he's saying is that the b'chol meidecha, the true experience of mitzvahs in the fullest sense of the word, is when they follow that connection. Like I mentioned, I'll just use the example that I gave yesterday. When the neshama does a mitzvah, it's not just a mitzvah being done, because the neshama is etzem chelik elekam emal mamash. It's etzem moyach ha'av. So for argument's sake, just to say the difference, for example, in Chumash, it talks about Eliezer Eved Avram. And he wanted to marry. He wanted his daughter to marry Avram. So Avram said, we don't mix the two. You're an Eved, and we come from a different stock. Even though Yofas Sichoshen Shalav De'avis, the servants of the patriarchs were very high level, but there's still an element of the difference between a child and a servant. The same thing in our relationship with God. Sometimes we're called Ben, sometimes Eved. So Eved has the quality of a lot of work, and it's actually an outsider, so to speak, where you come to, it's not just a son that, in a sense, is able to, like he says in Samach Vav from Zohar, a son who hangs around in the palace of the king. He can go into the inner chamber anytime he likes. A servant can't do that. A servant has a certain element of distance. So there's a quality in each. But when a neshama does a mitzvah, you have the ben, that is etzem moyecha'av, and plus that, he also has the mitzvahs. It wouldn't be like a stranger doing a mitzvah. Even though a servant doing a mitzvah is also a great thing. You're doing God's mitzvahs. So the fact that you have a neshama coming into the picture, and the neshama loves God with full intensity, b'chol meidecha, so then that's why mitzvahs need that, because that brings the Ohr Chodesh from who into Shmoi, and it brings it down below. In addition to that, there's another element, that the mitzvahs themselves are done with this level of passion. But what is Bapratis and Ba'emik Yeser is this, the first step that I just said. So it's not just that mitzvahs themselves are done with passion, but they're preceded by the neshama that has this b'chol meidecha. That's how I would explain this parentheses. If someone has another explanation, I'm open to hear. It's what comes to me when I'm learning it. But it sounds like that's what he's saying here.
Can I ask a question about this, please?
Hold on.
Okay.
I'm just going back to the question. When he first asked the question on page 1281, yeah, very clear. He keeps saying Hagdomes Haveda. One more place I want to look. The Simcha Shal Mitzvah. 1 second. Yeah, again on page 1265, Hagdama Tchila B'chinas Avarabba B'Tainugim. Yeah, there actually he elaborates on it. Yeah, that's the key here. It's of Hagdama. What I just read now, page 1280, 1281. Okay, good. Yeah, go ahead. What's your question?
So he says when you don't do a mitzvah, b'chol me'odecha, it's just revelation in the order of the whatever the Seder.
Yeah, that's what he said. Yeah, that's what he writes. Yeah.
Right. So that suggests that when you do a mitzvah b'chol me'odecha, that the Giluim is outside the Seder Hishtalshalos. But it almost sounds like Or Chadash. What we discussed in the mitzvah.
But he doesn't say Or Chadash. He doesn't say Or Chadash.
I know he doesn't say it, but he's saying, what could it, I'm asking you, what kind of Gilui is it if it's outside the Seder Hishtalshalos, if it's not Dafka, what we talked about, b'chol me'odecha, that it's an Or Chadash that's outside of the structure of the Seder Hishtalshalos, meaning it's outside Havaya, it's outside.
There are infinite levels of how one can do a mitzvah. You can do a mitzvah very routinely, mechanically, regularly. So this isn't a black and white type of levels. So the fact is, a person can do mitzvahs, and the full power of a mitzvah is unleashed when you do b'chol meidecha with full intensity. And a mitzvah without that would be more related to ishtalshalos. A mitzvah with a passion would reach all the way up, like he says, b'sharshay. Remember, it reaches all the way before the tzimtzum into the gilui la'atzmei of Yudke Vovke. That's a very, very high level.
That's Ratzon Elyon.
But it's still shmoi, not who. And but pratis is when you have the preparation beforehand. Now remember, even mitzvahs are done b'chol meidecha, they're done by neshamas. You can't do a mitzvah is not done by itself. A mitzvah can't perform itself. You have to have a neshama doing it. The question is whether it's a preparation before doing the mitzvahs or it's as the mitzvahs are being done. So he's explaining that in mitzvahs being done itself, there are also levels. There's a level where it's more connected to Seder Hishtalshalos. There's a level that's connected to higher than Seder Hishtalshalos, which is also before the tzimtzum, but still ultimately the level of gilui la'atzmei, like he said, etzem ha'er, but gilui la'atzmei. He called it atzmus ha'er, but it's still not who. It just has an element of that passion in the mitzvah. Now you could also say, since the neshama is doing the mitzvahs, even not talking about the hagdama to the mitzvahs, so there's an element of who also being nimshach in it. He doesn't say it explicitly. He just says that there's a need for b'chol meidecha, and that there's also mitzvahs themselves in a form b'chol meidecha. He says the words are because that's the full way, the complete way of doing a mitzvah. So it could be he's also referring to the higher level of who in the performance of the mitzvah. But it's still the main thing, the main power here is when we're going higher and hagdomit before it. So both ways can be explained and understood. And it's true. So what? So b'chol meidecha is in mitzvahs itself, but you could also have mitzvahs without it. So what are you asking? I mean, does that answer?
I think you explained it, but it suggested that doing a mitzvah b'chol meidecha is outside of Seder Hishtalshalos, which sounds
but
like
a mitzvah. But he said that till now. The whole thing is everything is outside of Seder Hishtalshalos. Even mitzvahs and Torah, he said, is gilui la'atzmei. That's a very high level.
Yeah, you answered my question. I mean, you addressed the issue I was raising, so that's I consider that answering my question. Thank you.
Okay, good. Okay. But I added the main point. I want to make sure it's underscored for everybody, and that is that he's saying in the parentheses that Hamshachas of mitzvahs, the way they're in their root, who gamkin ayidei b'chol meidecha dafka. In other words, mitzvahs themselves also have to be done b'chol meidecha for them to truly draw that higher energy, and they do draw an atzmistic energy. I would even say is the level of who. He doesn't say it explicitly, but I think he's saying that. So I gave really two answers here, to be honest. I gave one answer is that there's levels, that even the level of mitzvahs b'chol meidecha is still a level that's higher than ishtalshalos. But the second answer I'm saying is that b'chol meidecha in the mitzvahs is also the level of who, not just the level of shmoi.
Yeah, that was my question. So you're
but I gave two. But I wanted to emphasize, it's not about you and me now. I'm explaining the idea now. I want to emphasize that I gave two answers in understanding this point about Ava b'chol meidecha in mitzvahs. The main key thing that he's emphasizing here, at least as I understand it, is the difference between the mitzvahs themselves being done b'chol meidecha and the akdama to the mitzvahs being done b'chol meidecha. But both ultimately, as I said, the neshamas are the ones that do it, because you can't do b'chol meidecha without a neshama performing the mitzvah. The b'pratis be'emi really, my understanding of that, I just want to say a few more words about it. I think he's coming to say because you have the neshamas so-called in a pure form, not as they're performing mitzvahs, but the neshamas as they are on their own, and they're completely connected on an atzmizdika level, in the helam atzmi, with God. So that's what you have, and then the mitzvahs follow. The b'chol meidecha within the mitzvahs is also the neshama is doing. It's the who within the shmoi, but the hagdama before is like the who that precedes the shmoi, and then in turn is mamshech ha'er chadash into shmoi, into mitzvahs. So I think both.
He's saying that Shochesh al idei mitzvahs u davke al idei hagdomas o avodo din shomis bivchinas avorabo. So even if the mitzvah is having b'chol moedcho, it comes through the hagdomas o avodo din shomis bivchinas avorabo.
That's actually not what I said, but
this is what he correct. Said. He said
that's one thing, but there's another thing, that even the mitzvahs themselves, when you do them, the neshama is doing it b'chol meidecha. That itself also is vital for the hamshacha to come from the etzem in mitzvahs, and not just mitzvahs as they are on a regular basis, which would be more just seder shtalshus.
When you say the who within the shmo, do you mean the yud k within the mitzvah?
No, yud k is not who. Yud k is part of shmoi.
So what do you mean by the who within the shmo?
Who is the helam atzmi that's completely higher than any level of gilui?
I understand, but it seems like it's
where
a contradiction.
Are rooted. That's where neshamas are rooted. There's who, which is completely beyond Gedder. He said not even Mocker the Mocker. Shmoi has two parts, Yud K and Vav K. Even the Yud K is a gili, but it's a gili to himself. So then there's the who is the level of neshamas that we're talking about that do things b'chol meidecha and avarabba. And there's two states that he's describing. One is that precedes the mitzvahs, and one is the mitzvahs are being done with that b'chol meidech.
I understand all of that. We talked about that for the past couple of days. But what is it? It seems like a contradiction. Who and shmo are different. The dafke different, just like you said. So what does it mean to say the who?
But he keeps on saying here that when a neshama does a mitzvah, it's being mamshich teisvis oir chadash into havaya, who into shmoi. That's the whole piece that we're learning here. You said that a number of times.
So it's bringing the who into the shmo, but there's no who in the shmo.
I'm not sure what that means. What does that mean in not mechanically? What does that mean?
Well, bringing who into shmo is a new revelation, but bringing out the who from the shmo suggests that I guess it's just semantics.
No, there's no who within the shmo. That's not what we said.
I know. That's what I thought. That's what I thought I heard you say.
Anyway, practically speaking, we're talking about souls that are connected fundamentally with the divine on the level that's beyond any level of any revelation, any connection to existence, as I explained yesterday and today a bit. There's the level of Torah mitzvahs, which is the level of Shemai. And the whole point of explaining here is why you need to have the preparation of Avodah of Neshamas Yisrael and Avarabba, and why can't mitzvahs themselves accomplish it. The parentheses just adds another dimension that also the mitzvahs themselves also have the B'chol Me'idecha, which in the second way I explained it includes, that means a level of who, because essentially the neshamas are doing the mitzvahs with that passion, in addition to the introduction that comes before, which is the proteus and emek yes. So I just wanted to explain what that meant.
But what do you mean by preparation? I mean, is that a meditation or something before you do a mitzvah? I'm not sure what you mean.
It's very simple. A person is completely consumed with love for God. We learned at length, mutfa murgish muskel, right? A person first starts with an emotional connection that's more behavioral, reflexive, impulsive. Then the cognitive grows, the mind grows. A person is consumed and becoming divine consciousness. And they climb the ladder higher and higher to the point of bina, then chachma, the emre vetzes alabonim, the mother taking care of the emotions, the children, hovering over them, guiding them, to the point that the mind reaches places that go into the divine of gazing at arich and atik the energies of Atik, and Chochmah and Bina, together, the Yichud Pnimi of Abba ve'Ima, and that in turn creates that the emotions themselves catapult the mind to the deepest levels of Negei B'Nefesh, that God is Negei B'Nefesh to you. You can't live without it. So it's an all-consuming love. This is the state of being the person has reached. So even before they perform a mitzvah, as soon as they wake up, they have that. Yes, through Avodah, through davening, through his bonus, all that is part of the process, like we've learned. So it's a state of consciousness where you're completely consumed with God, and that, when you go then do a mitzvahs, the mitzvahs, you have both these. He says, then you have this chodesh and lamata mata. In addition to that, the mitzvahs themselves are done with a b'chol ma'idach.
So that means that, of course, you need
every morning when we davening is agdama to doing to Torah mitzvahs. Like you first, mismach geulat. What you have, is it called semech mitosei?
Hasemech tfilasei lemitosei.
Right. What were you asking?
No, I said that everything is starting with the neshama, but then b'koyach haneshama the mitzvah is mamshich, but the mitzvah itself needs also the b'chol me'edecha, because otherwise it's only begiluyim.
Yeah, correct. And I explained the two aspects of it. Yeah. Yeah.
But at that point, it's difficult to make a shuv at that point. Wow.
Anybody else want to ask anything?
No, I said that if the mitzvahs would not have the neshama, even the b'chol me'oitcha would not be able to reach that, the helam ha'atzmi, the who.
If the mitzvahs didn't have neshamas, there would be no b'chol me'edecha altogether.
Okay.
A mitzvah does not perform itself. Even the very kiyum mitzvah needs a neshama.
Right. Because if not a neshama, there's no mitzvah.
And definitely not b'chol me'edecha. I mean, a mitzvah is just as an instrument. It needs to be used. It needs to be performed.
If a guy will
performed,
do a mitzvah,
but like I said, it could be performed b'chol levavcha or b'chol nafshecha. We learned earlier that's more seder ishtalshlus. And then it could be performed b'chol me'edecha, which is l'mayla miseder ishtalshlus.
Where do we say that seder ishtalshlus begins? Is it Aliyas Haratzon and all the way back, Lifnei Tzimtzum Rishon, and before Or Ein Sof? We don't say Tzimtzum begins from the Kav, right? We say Tzimtzum. I mean, not Tzimtzum. Hishtalshlus. Seder Hishtalshlus begins where? And I assume we're relating this to Shmo. Seder Hishtalshlus is connected.
Hold on. So this is the answer to this is not this is not a black and white thing at all. It's all relative. If you go back to page 1283, he says Reishis Hishtalshlus is Bina, and Reishis Hagilui is Chochmah. That's what he said on page 1283. Generally speaking, you have to understand what means Hishtalshlus. Let's not use semantics here. Let me explain what Hishtalshlus means. Actually, Hishtalshlus does not begin till after the Tzimtzum, because there's nothing to talk about before the Tzimtzum. Before the Tzimtzum is Eid Ein Sof, Mamala Kol HaMetzias. All it is omnipotent and omnipresent, divine, seamless consciousness. That's all there is. There's no room for anything. Then a process begins called Tzimtzum, Rishimu, Kav, and what we call the Seder Shtalshus that the Kav creates is the cosmic order that goes from Ak, Bria, Atzilus, Bria, Yitzira, Asiya, and macrocosm, microcosm. Well, Chassidus comes, and even though it's already hinted to in Kabbalah before Chassidus, but Chassidus really takes it, is that the Eibishter wants us also to connect to pre-Tzimtzum consciousness. The problem is, it's completely beyond us. So for all practical purposes, Shtalshlus doesn't begin from Bina, is the real Reish Shtalshlus, and even Chochmah is called higher than Shtalshlus. Sometimes you say Shtalshlus begins with the 10 spheres, and Kesser is higher. So it all depends what you're discussing. Now, pre-Tzimtzum, once you're going there, In the Pri Tzimtzum itself, Chassidus talks b'shem hamushal, which means we don't have a language really to speak about it, but God revealed to us some of the process of what's going on. Can we just, everyone mute while I speak? So God revealed to us that even in his so-called inner essential divine consciousness, Pri Tzimtzum, he's also preparing the ground for existence. So what we've been learning here, and we take it for granted, but if you really want to talk about it, Pri Tzimtzum is so beyond us. It's only a schus, a merit, a gift that was given to us to speak about it. So what we say is, relatively speaking, in that divine consciousness, what he keeps saying, atzmusei, before Ishtalshlus, there's also stages, so to speak. And I say so to speak because it's not actual stages. It's so to speak also. There's a state that's beyond all Gilui, where he doesn't need consciousness and doesn't need awareness, and there's no revelation. And that's not even Koydem Alei Sarotzen. Because Koydem Alei Sarotzen means it's already in the world that you don't desire it yet, but you're preceding desire. It's like being born with a desire, but you don't yet, it hasn't been accessed. And then come the levels of Gilui La'atzmei, begins to come that he himself wants to be aware of it, because he wants to create Gilui, ultimately, like we learned earlier, that the whole point of Atzilus de Klolos, and I'm going back to page 1283, is there to be Gilui in existence. So God, so to speak, Kavyachal, so to speak, created within the whole Godhead of the divine seamless consciousness a state that we can talk about that will become the root. And subtly speaking, you can say relative to who it has a relationship, because God is envisioning existence. Or even before envisioning existence, he's considering it. He's deliberating on it. He's determining all the levels we learned in Tzadik Dalet and Ayin Beis in volume 2. And then finally comes the Shiur Atzmei B'Koyach, where he envisions and allocates resources. But it's still Sfiras Ein Ketz, he said, until the artist, before he is even being an artist, there's altogether nothing to talk about. He's not even, now he's chosen to be an artist, is already, relatively speaking, the beginning, not of a Seder Shtalshlus, but a relationship in some way with Seder, what will later be Seder Shtalshlus. Neshamas are rooted in the higher level. Mitzvos and Torah mitzvos are rooted in the beginning of the first Gilui La'atzmei. The teacher is beginning to think to himself, he's already identifying as an artist, but it's still Sfiras Ein Ketz. Then from those infinite possibilities will come one finite possibility, which is this also part of the infinite. Like he said at the top of page 1284, that the Eira Kav, so it's all still encompassed there in some way. It's encompassed. That's what he called the Hiskalus and the Helam. There's somewhat subtly some relationship, whereas who is completely removed from it all, which is the neshamas. So that's, and you have to always think microcosm, macrocosm, and everything is relative depending on what level you're talking about.
Great, thank you. The question though, if the neshamas, when neshamas are actually created, they're created as a ben to an av, and this atzmiyistic relationship which is concealed in who? It's in who, right? You said neshamas are in who, correct?
That's what he said, rooted in who, yeah.
So that would mean that there's already some type of giloy of neshama in this total ultimate concealment of who still has neshamas there because they're rooted there.
Define gilui. What does gilui mean?
A source that it exists. It's not. I thought we said
exists. It exists, but it doesn't exist in any. One second. Mitzias nimtza. It can exist, but it doesn't have any relationship to revelation, or consciousness, or awareness. It's just the fact that a father and a son are fundamentally connected, even if there's no gilui at all. Even when they're asleep, even when they're estranged. There's absolutely, you could have a relationship, you could have two things that are connected fundamentally, and there's no gilui at all.
But
so maybe you have to define the word gilui. No, gilui means some form of expression and revelation. That's not called gilui, what you're describing. That's called the atzmis. A gilui is when there's a teacher and a student, and even if the teacher is not revealing everything, but there's some form of relationship. Here, there's no relationship. It's just what it is. The etzem child is rooted in the etzem moyach. It's an atzmisdika thing.
But
the only thing you can say, it's not built in Mitzias Nimtza. but it's a Metzias Nimtza in a form of Helam Atzmi. And I explained this, I would say probably now at least 10 times. I would just suggest reviewing the classes, because this is what I've been explaining all the time. What means Helam Atzmi? That's not Gili. It fundamentally keeps saying, not even Shaykh is to Gili. Not just it's not revealed, not even in the realm of revelation. So you want explanation for that. I did explain it a number of times. I would just suggest reviewing it again and again until it's clear. So it's not Ata, but it's not Shmoi, it's who. I gave a lot of explanations yesterday for it with examples and a few classes about it. A connection that can be as asmistic connection with absolutely no gili at all. That would be like neshamis and God without Torah mitzvahs. God forbid. So they're fundamentally connected, but there'd be no revelation. Listen, you could be in this world, and a neshama can come to this world and never do any Torah mitzvahs, and it's fundamentally connected to God, but there's no giluyim involved. I mean, I don't know if it's possible for a person never to do a mitzvah. Even one thank you is a mitzvah already. But my point conceptually, that you could have two things that are fundamentally connected. That's why we need Torah mitzvahs. That's the whole point. You want to come bring it alive. You want to bring it into a conscious, integrated experience and in a revealed way. In Golus, we have the connection to the etzem, but it's completely fundamentally concealed. Okay?
It's just hard for me to understand how in this level of who,
and I even explained why it's hard to understand, because we're accustomed to Giluyim. We don't understand etzem. For this to be understood, you really have to start understanding etzem that's fundamentally not connected to any bilti mizgala etzem. That is fundamentally beyond Gili. The difficulty is because we are so programmed to experience Giluyim, sensory stimulation, and even deeper ideas, always somewhere, some consciousness. I've given so many examples. What can I tell you? I mean, I know it takes time to assimilate these ideas, but that's why I say I don't know how to speed it up. So I would just say is keep learning it and going over it again and again and reading it inside. You can listen to the classes. I mean, I'll keep explaining it as best as I can, but I have tackled this. This is not the side topic. This is the topic at hand. This is the theme of who and Helam Atzmi that's higher than Gili altogether. And yet, as I explained yesterday, the difference between built Metzias Nimtza Helam, and there's Metzias Nimtza Gili. Does anybody want to weigh in on this?
I mean, there was a time when Adam and Chava were created in this world, actually in this world, there were no mitzvahs yet. Even if you're going to say that there's always Sheva mitzvahs b'nei Noach before the Torah, I mean, Torah came 1,600 years later.
That's not accurate. First of all, okay, let's say it says that they were created la'avda l'shamra, to serve and to protect, and they say la'avda is the 248 positive mitzvahs, l'shamra is the 365 negative. It just was done spiritually, as we learned earlier, and it wasn't formally given it till Matan Torah, but they were put into the garden to serve God, and you serve God through Torah mitzvahs. However they did it. But what's your point? Let's even say that they even if there was no, what's your point?
No, your point. You were saying earlier that that if you had an
They couldn't eat Eitz Hagan. That was a mitzvah directly.
What?
Not to eat from Eitz Hadas.
Right, but that wasn't the first thing God said to Adam and Chava, right?
Well, even before he said, he created them in order to serve. That's a given. That's not even a question. That's the whole point. We're learning about they were basically supposed to be gardeners of Gan Eden through the L'Shamra. But what's your point? What are you trying to say? That
no, you were just trying to make a statement that a neshama with atzmistic relationship without Torah mitzvahs would be, or could I don't know if you use the word can't exist or couldn't exist, but I guess you can exist. Well, right?
But I beg to tell you that Adam and Chava were created la'avda l'shamra. This is a pasuk in the Torah. There was no such thing as their existence. The whole existence of Adam and Chava was to serve God. The purpose is to bring godliness into this world. However you define it, but that was sure. That's not even a question that's necessary.
But
I
even
was
though
saying
that
if a
was-
person hypothetically a neshama can live, there are people there are neshamas right now in bodies that are in prison because they murdered people, and so on. You could be a neshama and have an atzmisdik connection. There could be no giluyim at all. That's all I was making the point. Is it actually possible in reality? Probably not, because there's no such thing as a person that doesn't do even one mitzvah. But my point is, it's not, etzem and gilui are two different things. But the bottom line here is talking about the helam ha'atzmi. As I said, I did explain it. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not suggesting that it can't use more explanation, but I did go over it again and again. And I would suggest, just like I do, you review it, you learn it again, you discuss it, you try to understand it, find examples. I gave examples of our own personal lives, experiences that are beyond consciousness altogether. And then there's consciousness, but it's always going to be a challenge because we are trained. We live in the world of Giluyim. We don't live in a world of Etzem. It's hard for us to understand how Etzem works really, because it goes against most of what our experiences and our programming. But that's what Chassidus comes to teach us, deeper, higher levels. And I even explained why you need the Helam Ha'atzmi. And why doesn't God just jump from Ato to Shmoi, from Asmus all the way to the beginning of Giluyim? There is a level that's fundamentally beyond, and that's what we're talking about now. And from there comes, okay, fine. So let's continue after the parentheses, the bottom, 2 lines from the bottom. So he says, now, V'gam. Now, additionally, in addition to the Oyer Chodosh, the unprecedented energy that comes specifically from a place that doesn't relate at all to existence, this Hu, the Helam Ha'atzmi, and it comes Lamata Mata, because it's not subject to gradations and levels, which is, by the way, I don't know if it's by the way, but he said this also earlier. One second. Yeah. I'm just looking at something I wanted to see. Yeah, there's a whole piece on page 1272 and on, which I think we should reintroduce. We brought the Kunter Sachren. Yeah, how Torah mitzvahs are very much the very essence of the divine. But at the end of the day, it's still the level of Gili. Okay. Just pointing that out. So now he's saying, in addition to this, Begam, and additionally, Shaydezeh, through this Hagdama of the Avodah B'chol Meidecha, B'chinas Hakelim the Mitzvahs Gufa Nasim Oir. Remember, till now, even though he mentioned at the beginning that we're talking about transforming, that the Keli itself should become Oir, not just draw energy, but it itself, revealing its very root, its source. So till now he explained how B'chol Meidecha is a higher level of Hu, and draws down a new energy, and draws it down all the way below without any of the hierarchy and the gradations, because it's coming from such a level that's completely beyond Gilu. But now he's going back. V'gam, through this, through this Aveda of the Neshamas, B'chol Meidecha, and Avarabba, the Kalim of the Mitzvos itself become Ur. So in addition to them getting a new energy of Ur Chodesh in Havaya, in Shmoi, they themselves become Ur, the Kalim. The Ein Zerak, and this is not just Masha Keli Mamshecher. It's going back to the beginning of the paragraph. It's not just that the Keli is drawing down energy, like we learned earlier, that through mitzvahs you build a tikkun, hakelim, that every mitzvah aligns existence to the divine purpose, which is drawing energy into containers, like a healthy body. But now we're talking about not just that. Ki'im shemeir guf va'atzmus hakeli k'moi shehi b'sharsha. But the very container, the very action, the very container of the mitzvah, or the very body and core of the container, it's radiating the way it is in its source and root, which is higher than Gilui. So if you may recall, we learned why Kalim higher than Ur. So he said, because Ur still is a natural flow, even though God is higher than Gilui. But when you see the revelation of godliness, it makes total sense. Because Ur is naturally a reflection of its source. Again, the source doesn't need Ur. But once Ur exists, it seems natural. When you see a Keli, the Keli does not reveal anything. The Keli reveals that God could create something that conceals its source. Oyer is me'en hamoyer. When you look at sunlight, it tells you there's a sun. So in sun and sunlight, the sun needs the sun. The sun needs the sunlight. It depends. They're both creations. Lamaila, God doesn't need oyer. But when he reveals himself, the revelation is a reflection of him. A Keli, we learned, shows us that God is Kol Yochel. He can create something that in a revealed way is not a reflection of him. It's a creation of his, but it's not a reflection of him. So we learned earlier that this reveals a Kol Yochel of Atzmus. I'll just take you to the page where he said that. That was on a page where he spoke about the Rishimu and the, right here, page 1270. So he said those words. That Eir is Gili v'Keli b'chinas Hagbola v'Helam. Keli by definition means an identity, a parameter, and a state of concealment. But the Shadish is higher. And the Raya he brings is because Oyer is a natural reflection. So it only reveals to us the revelation of the divine. But if you want to know the omnipotence, so to speak, the power of God to create something that's not reflective of him, like he says, so to create light, what's the achievement? All he is expressing, he created something that expresses himself. But here he's creating a substance, something of an identity. So he says, that's a raya that the shade comes from the yechelas, the power of God to create something that it's not just an expression of himself in a revealed way. And that, he says, is what is achieved through this Aveda. So Torah Mitzvos on its own draws the energy, the divine energy into the container, and therefore we're aligned, existence is aligned to what God wants. But when you have the Ava B'chol Meidech of the Neshamas that are rooted also Kalim, but they're rooted the Kalim higher than Oyer, in the place where the Rishim is rooted, where you don't have any revelation at all. And they do the Torah Mitzvos and they have that intense, great love and passion of B'chol Meidecha, that takes the Keli itself and demonstrates its power as a divine power. So technically speaking, if you didn't have that, you'd have the mitzvahs drawing divine energy, but you wouldn't have the revelation of the divine that's higher than revelation. In other words, in a way you could say, like similar when we say that in Gan Eden, why? Because the Chol Chaya Elam Haba is all spiritual revelation. Like he says in Tanya, that's Hoyel Ulahem Yeridim Me'er Panav Yisbarach. Okay, it's revealing the divine. It's in this world, which is a world that conceals the divine. And that even there you're doing a mitzvah, that reveals a level of the divine that's higher than revelation, the etzem. In this case, what he's calling this level. So the Keli now, which on its own would have been either a state of concealment, or it's aligned with the Oyer of Ishtalshalos, or even the highest levels of Gilui. Now, it itself, existence itself, the Kalim themselves, are reflecting the root of the divine that is not subject to revelation and not expressed through revelation. But doing the mitzvah shows you take a physical object and you do a mitzvah with it, you are revealing that dimension. Okay. I'm going to stop here because now he's going to go through to tshuva, which we spoke about earlier, but I don't want to jump. We'll stop here at the bottom line on page 1286. Any questions? Just like the kavanah dira b'tachtenim, dafka the yesh, dafka tachtenim, dafka something that is not revelation, is also aligned to God, and that creates that. Yeah, it's like the yesh hanivra, yesh hamiti. Well, we learned earlier, it's like the difference between the neshama and guf. That la'asad lavi, the guf will nourish the soul. Today, the soul nourishes the body. So its is nourishing the keli. And in the future, the keli will nourish the neshama, the body will nourish the soul, because it will reveal its atzmi, its core connection to this level of the helam atzmi that's higher than and gili. You have both etzem and gili. Okay.